can't believe it's come to this after all these years.
He forgot the one day I thought he'd remember. The one day that didn't ask for much. No grand gestures, no expensive gifts. Just a call, a message, a few words to say, I remember you. But nothing came. Not a whisper, not a sound. That day, my 82nd birthday, passed like any other. But inside, something shifted. You see, when you give your entire life to someone, when you show up to every game, every graduation, every broken moment, they become your purpose. And when they forget you, you start to wonder if you ever mattered at all. I didn't get angry. I didn't cry. I just got quiet. I packed a small bag, turned off my phone, and walked away from everything I had built, including him. No warning, no goodbye, just silence. The world didn't stop spinning, but mine did. As I stood outside my home for what might be the last time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, freedom. Painful, honest freedom. There's something haunting about being forgotten by the person you never once forgot. Something that pierces deeper than words. I disappeared not to punish him, but to find myself again. I didn't know where I was going, only that it had to be far enough from the noise of expectation and close enough to the quiet where I could finally hear my own thoughts again. Maybe he'd notice I was gone. Maybe he wouldn't. But either way, I was done waiting. Some lessons can only be taught in absence. And some truths? They only echo loud enough to hear when all you're left with is silence. My name is Daniel. I'm 82 years old. And for most of those years, I lived for one thing, my son. Lucas was my light, my reason, the one constant that kept me moving forward when life tried to knock me down. I wasn't born into much. My father worked in a factory until his back gave out. My mother cleaned houses to keep food on the table. We never had luxuries, but we had values, discipline, gratitude, love. And I carried those values like a torch through the long, winding path of my life. I worked as a carpenter for over 5 decades. My hands are calloused, fingers stiff, bones worn thin from years of labor. But I was proud of every splinter, every scar. Each one told a story. Stories of shelves built for Lucas's nursery, of desks crafted for his studies, of beds repaired during long nights when money was tight but love was overflowing. I never cared much for vacations or new cars. My reward was always simpler. The sound of his laughter echoing through our small house. The look of pride on his face when I attended every school play, every ceremony. Rain or shine, sick or tired, I was there. Always. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom home tucked into the edge of a sleepy neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names. The kind of place where porch lights stayed on a little later for neighbors and time moved just a little bit slower. I planted an apple tree in the backyard the day Lucas was born. Every year it grew just like he did. And every fall, I'd bake a pie from those apples, the smell of cinnamon and warm sugar filling the house like a hug. That tree still stands. And until recently, so did everything else I built around it. Lucas was always a good kid. Sensitive. Bright. He'd sit on the floor with his legs crossed, watching me work in the garage, asking questions that made me laugh and wonder how someone so small could be so thoughtful. Why do nails hold things together? Does it get lonely when you cut it? He had this way of making the world seem softer, easier. When his mother passed, suddenly, cruelly, without warning, he was only 7. I was left with grief, so heavy it nearly crushed me. But I couldn't collapse, not with those small, searching eyes looking up at me. So I stood tall. For him. I learned to braid hair and pack school lunches. I learned what snacks he liked and how to fold laundry the way his mother used to. I learned to smile through sorrow and build happiness out of ashes. Everything I did was for Lucas. Every board I nailed, every bill I paid, every sleepless night. I watched him grow from scraped knees to awkward teenage silences, from angry slams of bedroom doors to his quiet thanks the day I handed him the keys to his first car. A beat-up old Toyota I'd spent months restoring in secret. Even as the years passed and life pulled him away, first college, then work, then his own family, I never once let go of my role. Birthdays, anniversaries, every Father's Day. I remembered it all. I showed up, sometimes uninvited, maybe even unnecessary. But I was there, always, because love, to me, has never been about convenience. It's about consistency. I believed, naively, perhaps, that the same would be true in return. Now the house feels emptier than it ever has. The floors creak louder. The light through the windows is thinner somehow. The apple tree out back still drops its fruit, but no one picks them up anymore. I still keep the pictures on the wall. Lucas at 6, tooth missing. Lucas at 16, cap and gown. Me, standing beside him with eyes full of tears and pride, so big it filled my chest like thunder. I remember every photo, every moment. I wonder how many of them he remembers. My days are slower now. Breakfast is quiet. The chair across from me stays empty. I talk to myself sometimes, maybe out of habit, maybe just so the silence doesn't win. I feed the birds. I fix things that aren't broken. I replay memories in my head like worn-out tapes. Some people dread getting old. Not me. I was fine with aging as long as it meant watching my son thrive. But I never expected to feel forgotten. This year, when my birthday came, I held my phone close all day. I checked the ringer. The signal even restarted at once. I told myself he was busy. Meetings, traffic, kids, something, anything. I made myself a small dinner, boiled potatoes, vegetables, and a slice of dry cake I'd bought at the corner store. I lit a single candle. No wishes, just habit. Midnight came, and I realized something devastating. I had become a footnote in the very story I helped write. And yet, I didn't break. I didn't lash out. I just stood up, washed the dishes, and quietly decided to leave. I remembered a place. A small cabin I built with my brother decades ago, before the arthritis, before the tremors in my hands. It sits on the edge of the mountains, past the winding road few people drive anymore. No neighbors, no noise, just wind, trees, and the distant calls of birds that don't care if it's your birthday or not. That place was always a symbol of solitude and peace. A backup plan. I never thought I'd need it. But as I packed that night, folding clothes into a worn leather duffel, I realized I wasn't running away from my life. I was walking toward something else. Something I'd forgotten in all these years of giving. Myself. I left a note on the kitchen table, but halfway down the street, I turned around and took it back. If he noticed I was gone, he'd call. If he cared, he'd look. But I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't explain. I've spent a lifetime speaking love through action. Maybe now, silence would say more. Lucas had always been the kind of son I was proud to speak about. Bright, ambitious, full of that restless energy that made you believe he'd one day change the world. He got a scholarship to a good university, moved out young, and started building a life for himself before I could blink. I was proud, of course, I still am, but pride has a strange way of blending with distance. You tell yourself the silence is success, that the empty calls are a sign of progress. You convince yourself that their world is just too loud for yours, and you accept it. Because that's what love does. It adapts. It stays. It waits. And I waited, even when the visits stopped coming regularly. Even when birthdays became belated texts and holidays were squeezed between business trips. I smiled through every excuse because I believed, maybe foolishly, that he would always find his way back. But as the years passed, those small moments we used to share, Sunday breakfasts, midweek calls, the way he'd pop in just to check if I needed anything, all faded into a haze of polite distance. I tried to ignore it, told myself this was just how life worked. Kids grow, parents age, priorities shift, and still, I showed up for him every birthday, every Father's Day, every minor celebration that could anchor us to some shared history. I never once forgot. But this year, when my birthday came, I sat alone. No knock at the door. No buzz on my phone. The hours passed like shadows stretching across the walls. I cooked myself a simple meal, not out of bitterness, but out of routine. I'd done the same for so many years that it felt strange not to. I lit a candle, not to make a wish, but to mark the day, like a lighthouse in the fog. But the fog stayed. My phone stayed quiet. And for the first time, I felt something shift, not in anger, not in sadness, but in clarity. I realized that I had been holding on to a relationship that no longer held me. I had become a chapter in his story that he no longer reread. I wasn't angry, just tired. Not of him, but of waiting. That night, I sat on the back porch beneath the old apple tree, the one I planted when he was born. Its branches were thinning now, much like mine. It dropped apples onto the grass like forgotten memories, bruised and overlooked. I picked one up and held it in my hand, staring at the marks on its skin, and it hit me. This tree had given fruit for decades without ever being thanked. It just gave, because that's what it was made to do. But even trees get tired. Even they reach a season where they stop producing, stop blooming. Maybe I had reached mine. The next morning, I packed a small bag. Just the essentials. I looked around the house. My house, though it hadn't felt like mine in years. It had become a museum of memories, frozen smiles framed on walls, a time capsule for someone who no longer visited. I didn't leave a note. I didn't call anyone. I simply left, quietly, like a man exiting a room where no one noticed he had arrived. I drove for hours, the road winding like the years I could never get back. I reached the cabin before sundown, a small, wooden place nestled among the pines, where silence wasn't empty, but peaceful. I unpacked slowly, each item deliberate, like I was rebuilding myself piece by piece. And for a moment, I felt peace. True, undisturbed peace. But of course, life never lets silence last for too long. 3 days later, my phone rang. Lucas. I stared at the name on the screen. A familiar name that once brought joy, now wrapped in hesitation. I didn't answer. I needed more time. Another call came the next day. Then a voicemail. His voice trembled slightly, not with panic, but with confusion. Dad, I'm so sorry. I forgot. I don't even know how. I've been so busy, and the kids had a thing at school. And I'm sorry. Please call me back. I listened in silence. There was the apology, the recognition, the guilt. But none of it changed the fact that the forgetting had happened, that I had felt invisible. I called him the next morning. My voice was calm, but I could feel the weight behind it. Years of swallowed disappointment, brushed aside moments, love given without acknowledgement. I told him I was safe, that I hadn't left because I hated him. I left because I realized I needed something more, something he hadn't been giving. Presence. Not gifts, not words, just presence. I told him that I was tired of being an afterthought. That love, without effort, feels like abandonment dressed in politeness. He didn't speak for a long time. And then, quietly, he asked, "Where are you?" I paused. Somewhere I can't hear myself again. That was the truth. I hadn't left to punish him. I had left to remember who I was when no one else was looking. And yet, in his silence, I heard something else. Realization. Maybe even regret. Maybe love, finally waking up from its long sleep. But I didn't push. I didn't demand. I'd done enough of that for a lifetime. The conflict wasn't about a birthday. It was about all the ones before that. About every small moment that added up to this quiet breaking point. I had built a life around showing up, and he had built one that forgot how much that meant. That's the thing about giving. It teaches people to expect, but not always to appreciate. And sometimes you have to disappear just long enough for them to notice what your presence really meant. The day after our call, I expected silence again. I thought Lucas might need time to process what I had said, to reflect on the hurt buried beneath my calm words. But the very next morning, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the cabin. It was early, just after sunrise, and the world still smelled of pine and dew. I peeked through the window, heart stuttering like it hadn't in years. And there he was, Lucas, standing by his car, looking lost in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy who scraped his knee and didn't want to cry. He hadn't called to say he was coming. He didn't bring flowers or a gift, just himself. That should have been enough. But when I opened the door and saw the guilt carved into his face, I realized something. He still didn't understand the weight of what had happened. He came because he wanted to fix things, patch it up, move on. But this wasn't a crack you could caulk over. This was erosion, years of slow, silent forgetting. We sat on the porch in silence for a while. The wind rustled through the trees, and the birds chirped like nothing was wrong. I offered him coffee. He nodded, and I brought out 2 steaming mugs, just like I used to do when he'd visit during college breaks. Back when I still believed he came because he wanted to, not because he felt obligated. Dad, he finally said, his voice low, I really am sorry. I know I messed up. I looked at him, not just at his face, but through it, into the man he had become. A good man, yes. A hard-working father. A provider. But blind in the way people get when they're too wrapped up in their own storms to see someone else's drought. You didn't just forget a birthday, son, I said. You forgot I was still here. His eyes dropped to the wooden floorboards, fingers wrapping tightly around the mug. I could tell he wanted to speak, to defend, to explain, to rewind, but there are no good answers when absence becomes habit. I've been busy, Dad, with work and the kids, and I know. I cut in gently. Life is loud. I understand. But I wasn't asking for your time every day, just to not be invisible. He looked at me, and there was something new in his eyes. A flicker of realization, maybe even shame. He started to say something, but stopped. Took a sip of coffee. Let the silence speak for him. You know, I continued, more to the trees than to him. Your mother and he used to dream about growing old and watching you raise your own family. We talked about dinners with grandkids, holidays where the house would be full again. But she passed, and my voice caught, surprising even myself. I hadn't said her name out loud in so long. I thought I could keep those dreams alive. Alone. For both of us. The air between us grew heavy, like fog that wouldn't lift. You didn't lose me in a moment, Lucas. You lost me over years. One small forgotten call at a time. One skipped dinner. One unreturned message. I just didn't realize I was being erased until there was nothing left to hold on to. His shoulders dropped as if the weight of my words finally settled on him. I could see him replaying it all. Missed birthdays, ignored voicemails, brief check-ins that never went deeper than "How are you?" before moving on. And I knew then, he wasn't cruel. He wasn't heartless. He was simply unaware. And that kind of neglect, the unintentional kind, is often harder to forgive. Because it doesn't come with apology or malice. It just happens, quietly, until you're gone. I thought you didn't need me anymore, he whispered. You always seemed so strong, so put together. I laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. Strong? Son, I was alone in a house filled with pictures of people who stopped visiting. I wasn't strong. I was surviving. He nodded slowly. His eyes, glassy now, met mine. I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought we had more time. That's the cruelest trick of all, isn't it? Time. We all think we have more of it. That there'll always be another birthday, another visit, another chance. Until there isn't. I never asked for much, I said. Just a call. A visit. A sign that you remembered I existed outside of your childhood. He swallowed hard. I thought showing up now might help. It might, I said softly. But it doesn't erase the silence. We sat with that for a long time. The kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled, but simply needs to be respected. He finally stood and walked down to the small path that led toward the lake. I let him go. He needed space to carry that weight himself for once. Not on my back, on his. And as I watched his figure disappear into the trees, I realized this moment was the first time in years I wasn't the one carrying the guilt. For once, he was the one trying to hold on to something that had started slipping through his fingers. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. He returned after nearly an hour, his shoes coated with pine needles, his face pale and quiet. There was something different in his expression now, less of the guilt he brought with him and more of a quiet, almost childlike vulnerability. It reminded me of when he was 12 and broke his mother's favorite vase. He didn't cry then either. He just stood in the hallway, holding the pieces in his hands, waiting to be forgiven. That look never really left him, even now as a grown man. We sat again, and he spoke with a little more truth this time. Not rehearsed, not defensive, just raw. He told me how overwhelmed he'd been, how fatherhood and work had consumed him, how every day felt like a race he couldn't win. He said he didn't mean to stop calling. It just became easy to believe there'd always be time. He said he never once stopped loving me. He just stopped showing it. That hit me harder than I expected, because love that isn't shown might as well be forgotten. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak, not because I needed an explanation, but because I wanted to hear his voice say things he never had the time or courage to say before. I missed you, he said finally, eyes glistening now. Not just today, for years. And I believed him. Not because the words were perfect, but because I could see the weight of them in his eyes. Then why didn't you reach out? I asked gently. Because I thought I let you down, he whispered. And the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to face you. That's the quiet tragedy of distance. How shame grows in the silence. How pride masquerades as busy schedules. And before you know it, love becomes awkward. It becomes work. Do you know what it felt like, I said, to wait every year and still believe you'd remember? To convince myself you would show up, until I couldn't convince myself anymore. He nodded. And do you know what it felt like, he added, voice trembling, to look at your number last week and realize I couldn't even remember the sound of your voice? There it was, the wound on both sides. Him, so lost in the noise of life that he'd tuned me out. Me, so silent in my suffering that I'd let him forget I was still here. I reached out, placed my hand on his, older than it used to be, heavier somehow, and I didn't speak. I didn't need to. That one gesture did more than any apology ever could. But I also knew that forgiveness isn't just a moment. It's a choice we make over and over again. He stayed for 2 days. We walked by the lake, shared meals like we used to, talked late into the night about everything and nothing. It wasn't perfect. There were long silences, some too heavy to ignore. But it was something. It was a start. He asked me about my childhood, about my memories of his mother, about the dreams I'd buried over the years. He listened, not out of obligation, but from a place of longing, like he was trying to piece together the parts of me he had forgotten. And in that, I began to remember parts of myself, too. The man I used to be before loneliness wrapped itself around me like a second skin. On the last morning, before he left, we stood outside under the apple tree. It had dropped a few more fruits during the night. Lucas picked one up and turned it over in his hand, just like I had days before. This tree, he said quietly, still gives, even when no one's picking up what it offers. I smiled. Yeah, but even trees get tired. He nodded slowly, then reached up and picked an apple from a low branch. The first time I'd seen him do that since he was a boy. Then I'll start showing up, he said. I'll pick them before they hit the ground. I didn't respond. I just watched him, this grown man who once held my hand crossing the street, now holding a promise instead. And I wanted to believe him. I really did. But promises like fruit spoil if not cared for. As he got in his car, I felt the familiar ache return. Not grief, not sadness, but the fragile hope that maybe this time things would be different. That maybe love, neglected for too long, could still find its way back to life. As the engine started, he rolled down the window. I love you, Dad, he said, the words catching slightly in his throat. I always have. I just forgot how to say it. I nodded, then start remembering, one day at a time. And with that, he drove away, back to his world. And I returned to mine, quieter, but not as empty. Because now, the silence felt temporary. It wasn't until days after Lucas left the cabin that the true weight of what had happened began to settle. Not just in my chest, but in the quiet corners of my thoughts where old memories and unanswered questions lived. At first, I thought his visit might be the closure I needed, or perhaps the fresh start we both had silently hoped for. But as the silence returned, I realized the real change wasn't in Lucas, it was in me. I no longer felt like a man waiting by the phone. I wasn't counting days or playing old messages on loop, trying to find comfort in borrowed words. For the first time in years, I was fully present with myself. That shift was subtle, like fog lifting from a lake in the early morning. There was no grand announcement or emotional breakdown, just a soft, still clarity. A realization that the life I had lived for so long, built around the role of father, provider, and protector, had quietly hollowed out the man behind it. For decades, I had been so focused on giving love that I had forgotten how to receive it, or worse, how to expect it. I raised my son with the belief that love meant showing up, sacrificing, and staying silent about your own needs. And now, looking back, I saw how that lesson had been absorbed by Lucas, too well perhaps. I had taught him that I didn't need anything in return, that I would always be there, without asking for anything. No wonder he thought forgetting my birthday was a small mistake. I had made my presence feel permanent, immovable, like a tree that would always bear fruit whether he picked from it or not. But trees have seasons, and so do people. That was the revelation I wasn't prepared for. Not that he had forgotten me, but that I had made it easy for him to do so. I realized I had been clinging to an identity that no longer served me. Fatherhood was the most important chapter of my life, but it couldn't be the entire book. There had to be more to me than my role in someone else's story. And now, in this small cabin surrounded by pine trees and silence, I finally had the space to ask, who am I when no one needs me? That question haunted me at first. It echoed in the quiet nights when the wind rattled the windows, and I found myself reaching for a conversation that wasn't there. But the longer I sat with it, the more I saw it not as a burden, but as an invitation to rediscover, to rebuild, to remember that my life still had value, even without applause, without being remembered. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. Nothing fancy, just little notes, reflections, fragments of memory that had nowhere else to live but the page. I wrote about the day Lucas was born, how his hand was so small it barely wrapped around my finger. I wrote about the smell of my wife's hair when she leaned in close during cold winter nights. I wrote about the silence in our house after she passed, and how I filled it with the sound of my own footsteps so Lucas wouldn't feel the emptiness. And slowly, word by word, I began to feel whole again. Not because anyone was reading my words, but because they were finally being heard by the one person who had been silent the longest, me. A few days later, I received a package. It was from Lucas. No note, just a small, leather-bound journal and a pen. Inside the cover, he had written, "For the stories you've never told." It wasn't a grand gesture. It didn't erase the years of absence or the ache of that forgotten birthday. But it was something real, a recognition, an offering. I held it in my hands for a long time before placing it on the table beside my bed. It wasn't time to write in it yet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was still learning how to speak in my own voice again. That was the real turning point. Not his apology, not the visit, not even the journal. It was the quiet understanding that I didn't have to be someone's father, someone's rock, someone's memory to have worth. My value didn't disappear when I stopped being needed. In fact, it was just beginning to reveal itself. I began to live differently in the days that followed. I woke up with purpose, not to wait for someone else, but to tend to my own heart. I cooked better meals. I took long walks. I started repairing the old dock by the lake, plank by plank, not because someone would use it, but because I wanted to. I smiled more, not because life was suddenly perfect, but because I no longer felt invisible to myself. Lucas called again the following week. His tone was different, softer, not rushed. He asked how I really was, and waited for the answer. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. The air between us had shifted, not cleared completely, but less heavy. I told him about the journal. He said he hoped I'd write about him, and I laughed. Maybe, I said, but don't expect a happy ending. He laughed too, and it felt good. Natural, human, not father and son trying to fix something, but two men learning how to speak a language they'd both forgotten. In that moment, I realized something else. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was just the chapter where everything finally started to make sense. Where love, long buried beneath routine and silence, started to bloom again, slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. And that was enough. The weeks that followed felt different, not just in rhythm, but in weight. I was no longer drifting through the days like a ghost of someone I used to be. There was purpose now, even if small. I woke up early, stretched my aching limbs, brewed my coffee with intention instead of habit. I began carving again, small wooden pieces, not for anyone else but for me. My hands, though slower now, still remembered the movements, still knew how to turn something rough into something shaped. I started to rebuild the dock one morning under a soft gray sky, and with every plank nailed down, I felt something inside me firm up too. Something steady, something unshakable. And that's when it came to me, not all at once, but gradually, like sunlight creeping over the mountains. I realized I hadn't just come here to get away. I had come here to reclaim something I'd surrendered long ago, the right to live for myself. Not in a selfish way, but in a whole way. For too long, I had defined my value through sacrifice, through the way I was needed by others. But now, in the quiet of this forest, I saw that being needed wasn't the same as being loved. And love, real love, shouldn't make you invisible. It should see you, choose you, even when it's inconvenient. Especially then. One morning, just as I was finishing the last board on the dock, my phone rang. It was Lucas. He asked if he could come visit again, this time with his children. They want to meet the man who built everything, he said. I paused. The old version of me would have said yes immediately, grateful, hungry for the scraps of reconnection. But the man I was becoming hesitated, not out of bitterness, but out of something deeper, self-respect. I'd love to see them, I said. But this visit isn't about you bringing them to meet someone. It's about you showing them what presence looks like. Are you ready for that? The silence on the other end wasn't long, but it was thick. Then, yes, Dad, I am. And I believed him, or I wanted to. Either way, I knew I wouldn't bend myself just to make things easier for him anymore. That was the shift. That was the moment I realized I was done shrinking to fit into someone else's idea of love. When he arrived, the kids ran ahead of him, two small rockets of energy and laughter. They hugged me like they'd known me forever, like they'd heard stories and had finally met the hero in them. And maybe they had. Lucas hung back, watching unsure. I welcomed them in, made cocoa, told them stories about their dad's childhood. They laughed at the idea of him once being afraid of spiders or losing a spelling bee. They asked me questions about the carvings in my workshop, about the lake, about the apple tree. It was joyful, yes, but under it all, there was a tension. Between me and Lucas, unspoken but undeniable. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, he joined me on the porch. You were right, he said, about all of it, about how I disappeared long before you did. I didn't answer right away. I watched the moonlight ripple across the lake and listened to the wind moving through the trees. I didn't want an apology, I said finally. I wanted you to see me, not just as your father, but as a man who still breathes, still aches, still wants to be held in someone's memory. He nodded slowly. I see you now, he said, and I'm sorry it took this long. And in that moment, I believed him, not because he said it perfectly, but because he was finally saying it from a place of understanding, not guilt. That was the climax, not a dramatic explosion of emotions, but a quiet revolution inside me. I wasn't just forgiving him. I was forgiving myself too, for staying silent so long, for allowing love to become obligation, for teaching him to take my presence for granted. I wasn't going back to the man I used to be. I had found something stronger here, something rooted. And this time, if he wanted to be part of it, he would have to show up, not just in words, but in presence. Every time, or not at all. The next morning brought a stillness that felt different from the usual quiet. Not empty, not heavy, just full. Full of breath, full of pause, full of space that had once been taken up by longing. I stood outside by the dock, the early mist rising from the lake like steam from an old kettle, and listened to the soft giggles of my grandchildren echoing from inside the cabin. Lucas came out a few minutes later, his steps slow, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets like a man carrying more than just cold. He joined me without a word, and we stood side by side, both of us watching the water shift and ripple, the way it always had, long before our conflict and long after it, too. You built this, he said quietly, nodding toward the dock. Every nail, every board. I nodded but said nothing. There was nothing special about that dock. Not in its construction, anyway. What made it sacred was the stillness it offered, the way it held your weight without question, like I had done for him all those years, like love should do if it's real. After a moment, he turned to me, and his voice broke ever so slightly. I never asked what you needed from me. I just assumed you'd always be there. You weren't wrong, I replied, looking him in the eye. I was always there. But that was the problem. You thought showing up didn't matter because I never stopped. So you stopped trying. The words weren't said with anger. They weren't meant to wound. They were said like a mirror being held up to his heart, clean and clear. He nodded slowly, like someone finally seeing his reflection for the first time. "I've spent my whole life trying not to be like you," he said, a painful truth hanging in the air. "Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't want to carry everything the way you did. I thought if I didn't look back, I wouldn't fall behind." That admission hurt, but it also revealed something deeper. Lucas hadn't just been avoiding me. He'd been avoiding himself. Avoiding the weight of becoming a man who cared too much, gave too much, and asked for nothing. He was afraid of becoming a ghost in his own life. And in that fear, he made me one. "I never wanted you to be like me," I said softly. "I just wanted you to remember I existed outside of your memories." His head dropped, and for a moment, I thought he might crumble. But instead, he did something I wasn't expecting. He stepped closer and hugged me. Not like a son hugging his father, but like a man hugging another man. Firm, present, sincere. "I don't want to forget again," he said. "I don't want my kids to learn that kind of silence." And in those words, I saw the shape of something I hadn't dared believe in for a long time. Change. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real. We spent that last day together, not talking about the past, but living in the present. I showed the kids how to sandwood, how to listen for the song of the wind through the trees. I taught them how to skip stones and let them beat me at cards. Lucas watched more than he spoke, like he was studying a language he'd forgotten. Before they left, he pulled me aside and said, "I want to come back. Not just visit. I want you to be part of their lives. Of mine, if you'll have us." I smiled, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wasn't. I had already decided that my happiness wouldn't be dependent on what others gave me anymore. I had found peace, not through reunion, but through rediscovery. But now, that peace had room for something else, connection, as long as it was built on presence, on truth. "You're welcome here always," I told him, "but not as a guest, as a man who shows up." He nodded, and I knew he understood. They drove off just before dusk. The kids waved from the back seat, their smiles framed by the windows like snapshots I get to keep. Lucas rolled the window down and gave me a small salute. "See you soon," he said. Not "I'll try," or "maybe next month." Just soon. And this time, I believed him, not because of the words, but because of the weight behind them. As I watched them disappear down the road, I didn't feel the ache I had felt so many times before. I didn't wonder if I'd hear from him. I didn't doubt my place in the world. I had stood up for myself, not with anger, but with quiet strength. And in doing so, I had changed the shape of our relationship. It was no longer about what I gave or what he forgot. It was about what we were willing to build from here on out. Together, but separately strong. The days after they left were quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet that used to haunt me. This was a different kind of silence, peaceful, chosen, even welcome. It wasn't filled with waiting or wondering. It didn't echo with disappointment or stretch with the ache of absence. Instead, it felt settled, like the air after a long storm, when the trees are still dripping and the world smells new. I went about my days without checking my phone every hour, without watching the road for headlights that never came. I carved, I walked, I cooked small meals for one without bitterness. I tended to the dock, sanded down the bench beneath the apple tree, and let myself exist without expectation. I wasn't counting the time between phone calls anymore, because I had stopped measuring my worth in someone else's schedule. And for the first time in what felt like decades, I felt whole without anyone else having to see me to confirm it. A few days later, Lucas sent me a photo. It was of his daughter, the youngest, standing beside a tiny sapling they had planted in their backyard. The caption read, "We named it Grandpa's Tree." I stared at that image for a long time. A small thing, really a gesture, but in it. And for a moment, I thought he might crumble. But instead, he did something I wasn't expecting. He stepped closer and hugged me. Not like a son hugging his father, but like a man hugging another man. Firm, present, sincere. "I don't want to forget again," he said. "I don't want my kids to learn that kind of silence." And in those words, I saw the shape of something I hadn't dared believe in for a long time. Change. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real. We spent that last day together, not talking about the past, but living in the present. I showed the kids how to sandwood, how to listen for the song of the wind through the trees. I taught them how to skip stones and let them beat me at cards. Lucas watched more than he spoke, like he was studying a language he'd forgotten. Before they left, he pulled me aside and said, "I want to come back. Not just visit. I want you to be part of their lives. Of mine, if you'll have us." I smiled, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wasn't. I had already decided that my happiness wouldn't be dependent on what others gave me anymore. I had found peace, not through reunion, but through rediscovery. But now, that peace had room for something else, connection, as long as it was built on presence, on truth. "You're welcome here always," I told him, "but not as a guest, as a man who shows up." He nodded, and I knew he understood. They drove off just before dusk. The kids waved from the back seat, their smiles framed by the windows like snapshots I get to keep. Lucas rolled the window down and gave me a small salute. "See you soon," he said. Not "I'll try," or maybe next month. Just soon. And this time, I believed him, not because of the words, but because of the weight behind them. As I watched them disappear down the road, I didn't feel the ache I'd felt so many times before. I didn't wonder if I'd hear from him. I didn't doubt my place in the world. I had stood up for myself, not with anger, but with quiet strength. And in doing so, I had changed the shape of our relationship. It was no longer about what I gave or what he forgot. It was about what we were willing to build from here on out. Together, but separately strong. The days after they left were quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet that used to haunt me. This was a different kind of silence, peaceful, chosen, even welcome. It wasn't filled with waiting or wondering. It didn't echo with disappointment or stretch with the ache of absence. Instead, it felt settled, like the air after a long storm, when the trees are still dripping and the world smells new. I went about my days without checking my phone every hour, without watching the road for headlights that never came. I carved, I walked, I cooked small meals for one without bitterness. I tended to the dock, sanded down the bench beneath the apple tree, and let myself exist without expectation. I wasn't counting the time between phone calls anymore, because I had stopped measuring my worth in someone else's schedule. And for the first time in what felt like decades, I felt whole without anyone else having to see me to confirm it. A few days later, Lucas sent me a photo. It was of his daughter, the youngest, standing beside a tiny sapling they had planted in their backyard. The caption read, "We named it Grandpa's Tree." I stared at that image for a long time. A small thing, really a gesture, but in it,